In this video, I'm going to talk about putting the first layer of planking, cold molding, on the bottom and the sides. But I want to first show kind of how I did this layering. I used 4mm ply, and so this is a cross section of the how the planking is going to overlap at the chine. And so this is, of course, upside down, so the bottom of the boat is here. So what I did is I did the first layer of planking. I started on the bottom, and then I sanded it flush to the outside of the chine, and then I did the first layer of cold molding and on the sides, and then sanded it flush with the bottom of this area right here. And then I did the second layer of planking on the bottom, and then sanded it flush with the outside of this first layer, and then just kind of continue that. And the reason I did it that way is so my final layer of planking on the bottom would then lap over the side. That's what I wanted. And so that's how I did that. And I recommend doing that so your last layer on the bottom laps over the last layer on the side. It may not be critical to do that, but I think it makes it a little stronger. So what this video is talking about is this first layer right here on the bottom, and then this first layer on the side. So here the first here's the first piece of bottom planking that I put on the boat, and I did this full piece. The boat's flat enough that you can do that in the back portion. So this is basically a 4x8 sheet that's been trimmed. So this dimension from here up to here is basically 8 feet, and then of course it's not 4 feet wide because the boat is not, so that's been trimmed off. And you notice it's at an angle. You want to do your planking layers alternating angles. 45 degrees is ideal, but it doesn't have to be exactly that. Mine weren't. I think my angles are roughly 35 degrees or something like that. So this first piece is put on, and as one piece, and you can see these shims in the back. My fairing right at the very back, it looked like this was kind of curving, which would be down towards the floor just slightly. So I put some shims in there, and those, of course, got faired off later. So what I did is I put encapsulating epoxy on the underside of these pieces at the frames and wherever they would contact, actually the battens, sorry, not the frames, where they would contact those, and then I put encapsulating epoxy on the battens. I believe I did that too, and then I used the thicker epoxy on all the contact surfaces. So there's just a side view of those shims. It looks kind of ugly now, but once you sand it off, you don't see it. And I also did shims on this other side too. So you can see I started with these two big pieces and got those on. And then you've got to do strips. And the width of those strips can vary. I tried to do them as wide as I could where I could. So in these next areas, still relatively flat on the boat, so you can have pretty wide planks. Now again, mine's 4mm ply. If you use 6mm, then the widths of these probably wouldn't be able to be quite as wide. And so here you can see I did the same thing with these pieces as I did encapsulating epoxy along everywhere with the contact surfaces and the battens and the keel and the chine, and then I put encapsulating epoxy on these pieces and on the chine and battens and so forth. So, and then use thicker epoxy actually for the gluing. And you can see as I'm moving forward, the pieces do get narrower. They have to, just to conform to the curve of the boat. So you can see I'm working my way towards the front. And here's a picture, got it all the way up to the front. And if I zoom in a little bit, what I ended up having to do is actually trim these after they're epoxied on. And I used my Dremel tool, and it kind of worked. It wasn't the cleanest, but it worked well enough. And so here you can see both sides of the bottom planking are done now, and this is after I did a little trimming, and it's again not the best, but once you get the side plankings on, which I'm about to go through, then you can fill in epoxy there, and then it's no problem. One thing I forgot to mention, actually I might have mentioned in an earlier video, is before I did the bottom planking, I did use 2 coats of CPES and then 2 coats of encapsulating epoxy before I did the planking, and let that dry, and then I did my encapsulating epoxy and thickening epoxy when I actually epoxied these boards on. I did the same on the sides, so 2 coats of CPES on all these contacting surfaces, and I went ahead and did all the frames and everything just to seal them up, and then 2 coats of encapsulating epoxy. And so if you remember from that first drawing, that diagram I showed you, the boat now, I'll go back, is actually these, the planking you can see is all trimmed flush with the sides, and so it's ready for these, the side planking. And so now these can just go right, lap up over, they lap the bottom first layer of planking. So here I'm just dry fitting my first 2 pieces of side planking, and I did a similar thing as I used encapsulating epoxy as I was epoxying these on, and then thicker epoxy also. And there you can see I'm just working my way. If I did it again, I would actually trim these instead of leaving them squared off like that. It just makes it a little easier for trimming later, but it worked okay. I mean, I just ran my jigsaw along here 1/2 inch or so above the bottom of the boat, and then used my hand belt sander to trim them off, and I did the same thing on the bottom. So working my way through, and here's towards the front on that port side, and you can see up here that the cuts aren't quite as clean, but again that fills all in nicely with thickened epoxy and makes a nice surface there. And this is just a picture showing as I'm working towards the back, and you can see I actually started trimming the angles off as I was working here. Some of those just made it a little easier to work with. And one thing to notice, you can see the grain, even though this is plywood, but when you bend along the grain this way, it's stiffer versus when you bend these pieces along this grain. So I kind of cheated in the back because this is very curved in a compound angle, and it was tough. I was finding it tough to get pieces to conform, so I used these side grain pieces, and it helped me fit them in and get them glued in easier. And you can see how I was using some clamps and things to get creative on how to hold them. And I used my composite brads, put a bunch of them in all these pieces. You can see some of them here, and as I went along. So here's just a close-up after I've done some trimming here, and I've done some rough trimming along this top edge, and actually used my hand belt sander to get it close. It wasn't fully trimmed yet, but now I'm getting. You can see where I'm getting. Again, it's not fully sanded down. I haven't done the final sanding yet, but I was about to here. And this picture, I believe I did sand off this side. Actually, no, I didn't yet. I think I waited till I got the other side done before I did the sanding. And this is just showing kind of setup I used to cut those planking pieces, and I ended up using this battery-powered skill saw. It was just lighter and easier to work with. And when I cut these off, because remember I didn't cut angles, I just cut them straight, so it made it pretty easy to do. And I ripped the pieces in my table saw strips. So this is just showing the other side of the boat as I'm working my way. This would be the starboard side. And as I was going along, sometimes I noticed these planking pieces, you want the gaps to be nice and tight. But then as you glue them on, sometimes you get a piece that, I don't really have a picture of it, you get where pieces bowed just a little bit in some areas. And so I just got creative with holding with these boards and whatever I could do to kind of hold, and then I put some epoxy in the slot in between them, and then basically held them in place with boards like this. And I did that several times. And the other side I noticed too, because I didn't necessarily want to fair all that off if it wasn't smooth in between the two pieces out. And you can see evidence, like right here is an area where I actually flattened it out, and I had held it with boards like this earlier. And so that actually worked pretty good because you want to do some fairing with each layer before you go on to the next layer. And this is just showing on the starboard side how I use the grain of the plywood of these last few pieces the other direction to help with the bend. And here's just another example of me trying to flatten out some pieces that were not quite flat. So this is just showing that side done now, and I still haven't done the final sanding on that top edge because I want it to be flush with the bottom. And this is, I believe I have done that sanding now, so you can see how that's a nice flush edge. So then the next layer will go on will be the bottom planking layer to lap over, and I will sand it flush with the side. So here's after I've done all of the sanding along those edges, and you can see how I've got kind of weird patterns. What I did is I just took my sander, I was just sanding things off and trying to do some fairing to get it smooth in between these planking pieces. So there it is, and it's at this point ready for the next layer, second layer on the bottom of the bottom planking.